My daughter brought home a man who drove a Land Rover and knew how to shake hands like a politician. Everyone at the party told me they were perfect together. Standing at my own birthday celebration, surrounded by people I'd known for 30 years, I felt the wrongness of it like a splinter I couldn't find. That was 6 months before she pressed a folded napkin into my palm during the cake cutting and whispered, "Dad, please read this alone." Before I tell you what was written on that napkin, let me tell you about the moment I first knew something was wrong with Ethan Marsh. He arrived at my house in Astoria that first Sunday in September, driving a black Land Rover Defender with Oregon plates. I ran through a contact before dinner was finished. The vehicle was leased, 9 months behind on payments. He didn't know I'd checked. He sat at my dining table with the easy confidence of someone who has never been seriously questioned about anything, asking about the view from my windows, the square footage of the house, whether the coastal property market had treated me well. Not once did he ask about my daughter. Not once did he ask what Claire enjoyed, what made her laugh, what she was working toward in her residency. He looked at her the way people look at a door they intend to open. My daughter is 31 years old. She's a pediatric resident at OHSU in Portland, 3rd year, the kind of doctor who stays an extra hour because a child is scared. Her mother passed when Claire was 16, and the two of us built something solid from that loss, something quiet and honest. She learned early that I see people clearly. She also learned that I don't always say what I see. I smiled through dinner. I asked Ethan appropriate questions about his work, his background, his family. He told me he was a real estate developer with projects across the Pacific Northwest, that his sister Rachel handled the financing side of the business, that they'd built something together from nothing. He said it with rehearsed pride, the kind that sounds genuine until you've heard hundreds of witnesses use that same careful tone. I spent 40 years as a federal judge in the District of Oregon. I retired at 67 because my knees gave me trouble in the courtroom and because Claire asked me to be present for a while before I became an old man without noticing. I had presided over 214 criminal trials. I had sentenced people for bank fraud, wire fraud, mortgage fraud, elder financial abuse, and a particular category of manipulation that the law calls undue influence. I understood, in my bones, the architecture of a con. After Ethan and Claire left that night, I sat in my study and called my oldest friend, a man named Gerald Okafor, who had spent 30 years as a supervising agent with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division in Portland before retiring to teach at Lewis and Clark. I told him what I'd observed. He was quiet for a moment. "Give me 48 hours, Gerald said. 48 hours later, he called back with a tone I recognized from courtrooms. The Land Rover was the least of it. Ethan Marsh had 2 LLCs, both dissolved, one in Oregon and one in Washington state. He had a pending civil judgment in King County for breach of contract, an unpaid IRS notice for $86,000, and a prior relationship with a woman in Bend whose family had filed a complaint with the Oregon Department of Justice 18 months ago, a complaint that had been investigated and closed, without charges due to insufficient evidence. His sister, Rachel Marsh, held a mortgage broker license in Oregon that had received 2 regulatory inquiries in the past 3 years. I thanked Gerald and set the phone down. I looked at the photograph on my desk. Claire at her medical school graduation, laughing at something out of frame, her mother's cheekbones, my stubbornness. I didn't call Claire. Not yet. I had spent a career waiting. You do not move until you understand the full shape of what you are dealing with. Partial information produces partial justice, and partial justice has a way of letting the worst parts survive. Over the following weeks, I watched carefully. Ethan came to Astoria 4 times. Each visit, he found a way to walk through every room of my house, asking about this object or that painting, curious in the way of someone building a catalog. He asked about my pension twice, once calling it your retirement situation as though money were a delicate subject between us. Claire watched these moments with a slight tension I recognized, a tension she was working to suppress, the look of someone telling themselves they misread what they just saw. He was charming. I will say that honestly. He had the gift of making you feel like the most interesting person in the room for exactly as long as he needed you to feel that way. He volunteered at a food bank, or said he did. He brought wine that cost enough to signal awareness of money without being vulgar about it. He spoke about Claire with the vocabulary of a man in love, tenderness layered over calculation the way paint covers drywall. By November, I had learned through Gerald's contacts and my own quiet research that Ethan and Rachel's business model was not real estate development. It was proximity. They identified targets, typically older individuals with visible assets and limited immediate family, and constructed relationships around them. The King County complaint had involved an elderly widow whose son had grown suspicious after she'd changed her will. The Bend complaint had come from a woman's adult daughter. Same pattern. In both cases, Ethan had moved on before charges could be formalized. My house in Astoria sits on 2 acres of coastal property. The house itself is modest, a 3-bedroom craftsman that I have not renovated because I see no reason to. What is not visible from the outside, or from any room Ethan walked through, is the investment portfolio I built over 4 decades of careful, methodical living, a portfolio that a financial advisor in Portland manages with the same discretion I used to manage courtroom proceedings. It is worth considerably more than anything Ethan Marsh had ever been near. He didn't know that. He thought I was a comfortable retiree with a nice view and a federal pension. He was planning for the pension. I know this because in late November, 3 weeks before my birthday celebration, I heard him. Claire had driven up from Portland for a weekend visit. Ethan arrived Saturday afternoon. I was in the garden when they arrived, and I stayed there longer than necessary, moving slowly the way old men do, letting them settle into the house without me. Through the kitchen window, open 2 inches against the November cold, I heard Rachel's voice on speakerphone. "She's getting close to him," Rachel said. "That's good. That's exactly what we need." "I don't like the timeline," Ethan said. "He's 68. He's healthy. This could take years." Rachel's voice had the patience of someone who had done this before. "You don't need years. You need the right moment. Medical power of attorney first. Then we assess his accounts. The judge title doesn't mean money, but the house alone is what, 700,000? Closer to 900 with the land." Ethan said, "There it is." Her voice was satisfied. "After the new year, start the conversation about his memory. Gently. She loves him. She'll believe what you tell her." I stood very still in the garden. The Pacific was gray and flat beyond the dunes. A gull passed overhead without sound. "She'll believe what you tell her." I went back inside through the side door. Claire was arranging flowers in the kitchen. She smiled when she saw me, and I smiled back. And I said nothing about what I had heard, because I needed to understand how much she already knew, and how much she had been told to believe. Over dinner that night, I watched her, watch him. What I saw clarified everything. She was in the early stages of doubt, the phase where a person has begun to sense something is wrong but has not yet given themselves permission to name it. She was still hoping. When Ethan reached for her hand, she let him take it, but her eyes didn't warm. 3 weeks later, on the evening of my birthday celebration, she pressed a napkin into my hand. My longtime colleague, Patricia Wren, had organized the party. 47 people in the community room of a restaurant I had eaten at for 20 years, former clerks, old friends, neighbors, 2 retired federal prosecutors I had worked alongside for decades. Ethan was there. Rachel was there. The first time I had met her in person, a woman with her brother's easy smile, and her brother's habit of standing near things of value. I gave a short speech, ate dinner, made my way around the room. Watched Ethan work it with the quiet expertise of someone who has practiced being charming at exactly this kind of gathering. He introduced himself to the prosecutors as a businessman interested in community development. He told Patricia I was like a second father to him. He said this with his hand on her shoulder and a voice full of warmth that had nothing underneath it. During the cake, Claire stood beside me. She hugged me for the photograph, and when she pulled back, she pressed the folded napkin into my left hand with a precision that told me she had been thinking about the right moment for a while. She looked at me for exactly 1 second with her mother's eyes, steady and frightened, and decided. I tucked the napkin into my jacket pocket and finished the photograph. I told 2 more jokes. I thanked Patricia, and then I excused myself to use the restroom. In a locked stall, I unfolded the napkin. Claire's handwriting, careful and small the way it always was when she was scared. Dad. 3 weeks ago, I heard Ethan on the phone with Rachel. He said they were going to convince me you have memory problems, so I'll get medical power of attorney, and they can access your accounts. He said you're the best target they found in 2 years. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know if you'd believe me or think I'd misheard. I thought about leaving him, but he's been watching my phone. Tonight is the first time I've had a moment alone. I'm so sorry. Please help me. Please don't let them know I told you. I'm frightened. I read it twice, folded it, put it back in my pocket. In the mirror above the sink, I saw my own face. I have been told I am difficult to read. This is a quality I work to develop because a judge, whose reactions are legible, loses half his usefulness before the first witness is sworn in. The face in the mirror was calm. Behind the calm was something I had not felt in years. A particular cold clarity that used to arrive at the start of complex cases, when all the facts aligned and the path forward became precise. I straightened my jacket and walked back out to my party. I found Ethan at the bar with one of my former clerks, a young man named Douglas who had clerked for me a decade ago and now practiced environmental law in Portland. Ethan had one hand on Douglas's shoulder and was explaining something about waterfront development. Douglas looked mildly trapped. I stood beside them. Ethan turned with his full smile deployed. "Robert, great party. You've got good people in your corner." I smiled back with everything I had. "I really do," I said. "I spoke to Gerald before I left the parking lot that night." He answered on the second ring. "I need everything formalized," I said. "The documents, the prior complaints, the dissolved LLCs, the King County judgment, the IRS notice, all of it assembled and ready." He was quiet for a moment. "When?" "When I decide to move." "How long?" "I don't know yet. A week, maybe 2. I need to talk to my daughter first." Gerald said he'd have the file ready within 3 days. Then he said, "Robert, just tell me one thing. Is she safe right now?" I thought about the napkin, about the phrase "watching my phone." "I think so," I said. "But we're going to move carefully." The next morning I drove to Portland. I didn't call ahead. I knew Claire's Sunday schedule because we had talked about it every week for 3 years, an old habit from her intern year when I worried, and she let me. I arrived at her apartment building at 9 in the morning and called her from the lobby. She came downstairs in scrubs and running shoes, and when she saw my face, she understood immediately that she didn't need to explain anything. We walked to a coffee shop 2 blocks away. She told me everything, the full version, without the constraint of a napkin. 3 weeks ago, she had gone to use Ethan's laptop to print a boarding pass while he was showering. She'd heard him come out of the bathroom and reached for the nearby phone to make it look like she hadn't used the laptop. She accidentally picked up his unlocked phone instead and saw an open message thread with Rachel. The thread contained a detailed timeline. Month 1, build trust with the daughter. Month 2, introduce the memory concern narrative. Month 3, introduce the power of attorney conversation, frame it as protection for dad. Month 4, begin asset assessment. She had set the phone face down before he came into the room. She had smiled through breakfast. She had driven back to Portland and spent 3 weeks trying to decide if she had actually seen what she saw. "He started mentioning your forgetfulness in conversations," she said. "Little things, like, 'Oh, your dad forgot he mentioned that, remember?' And I'd think, 'Did you?' He's been building a file in my mind, Dad. A file about your decline." I watched her hands around her coffee cup, the same gesture her mother used when she was frightened. "I need to ask you something," I said. "When this is over, what do you need from me?" She looked up. "Not what you think I need," I said. "What you actually need." She thought for a moment. "I need to be the one who ends it with him. I need to do that myself. I don't want to just disappear from his life and have it feel like something was done to me again." "That's exactly right," I said. I drove back to Astoria and called Jessica Tanaka, who had been a federal prosecutor in the District of Oregon for 22 years before entering private practice. I had known her since she tried her first case in my courtroom 30 years ago. She was, without question, the most formidable attorney in the Pacific Northwest, and the only person I would trust to walk into a situation like this without wasting a single motion. She answered on the first ring the way she always did. "Robert, I have a situation," I said. "How bad?" "Bad enough for a Sunday call." She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "My office tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Jessica's office was on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Portland with a view of the West Hills. I brought Gerald's file and a printed copy of the message thread Claire had photographed on her way out of Ethan's apartment 4 days after the birthday party, when she had gone back for her winter coat and 30 seconds alone with his phone. Jessica read everything without speaking. She turned pages with the methodical calm of someone who has absorbed worse in an official capacity. She looked up, elder financial abuse, Oregon statute, Class B felony. Conspiracy, if we can tie Rachel's communications. The message thread is admissible, as found evidence if Claire photographed it on her own initiative without your instruction. She did? I had no contact with her phone that day, I said. Good. She tapped the file. Gerald's documentation establishes the pattern, prior victims, prior complaints. The King County matter didn't result in charges, but it establishes a behavioral signature. Combined with the specific intent documented in those messages, we're looking at a strong criminal referral to the district attorney. What about my position? I said. Former judge. Does that create complications? She smiled, not warmly. It creates leverage. Nobody wants the optics of prosecuting the adult child of a retired federal judge for failing to protect her father. And conversely, nobody wants the optics of letting two people walk away from targeting one. She closed the file. I'll file for a protective order this week. We'll document everything quietly for 10 days, then move. I went home and did something that required more patience than anything else in the preceding months. I continued normally. Ethan called me on Tuesday, a friendly call, asking how I was feeling after the birthday celebration. He mentioned casually that I had seemed a bit tired at the end of the evening. Had I been sleeping well? Stress at my age could affect cognitive function. Did I know that? He had an article he'd been meaning to send me. I told him I slept like a rock and had never felt sharper. I kept my voice warm and slightly oblivious. He moved to the next phase within 48 hours. He called Claire and raised the question of whether I had seemed different to her lately. She called me immediately after and told me exactly what he'd said. We had agreed she would do this. Report everything. Create a documented record of his communications. Rachel sent a text to Claire that same week. Thinking about your dad, he seems like he might need more support around the house as he gets older. If you ever want to talk about options, let me know. The word options landed like a marker planted in the ground. On the 9th day, Jessica filed for a temporary protective order in Multnomah County, restricting Ethan and Rachel from contacting me or Claire directly or indirectly. Simultaneously, Gerald's completed file was hand-delivered to the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office by a former colleague of mine who still worked in the building and knew which cases deserved immediate attention. I was not there when Ethan received his copy of the protective order, but Gerald's source in the building where Ethan rented a co-working desk told us that he spent 40 minutes on the phone in the parking lot shortly after and had what witnesses described as a controlled but visibly distressed conversation. Rachel called Claire 3 times within 2 hours. Claire did not answer. Ethan called Jessica's office directly, apparently not having read the documentation carefully enough to understand that calling any representative of mine was also a violation. Jessica noted it. Claire called me that evening. Her voice was steady in a way that told me she was working to keep it that way. He texted my emergency contact number, she said, the one I use for hospital communications. He said he needed to talk to me directly, that there had been a misunderstanding, that I was being manipulated by a father who couldn't let his daughter have her own life. I pressed my hand flat on my desk. What did you do? I screenshot it and sent it to Jessica, and then I blocked every number I have for him, she said. And then I sat on my bathroom floor for 20 minutes. That's exactly right, I said. She laughed, a short and slightly exhausted sound. You keep saying that, because you keep doing it exactly right. 2 weeks after the protective order, I was contacted by the assistant to the Multnomah County District Attorney who told me, in the careful language of someone representing an office that processes serious matters, that the criminal referral was being reviewed and that they anticipated formal charges being filed within 30 days. The charges would include attempted elder financial abuse, criminal conspiracy, and wire fraud based on interstate communications documented in the message thread. Jessica informed me separately that Rachel, upon receiving notification of the investigation, had contacted the DA's office directly through her own attorney, expressing willingness to provide information about the broader pattern of conduct in exchange for sentencing consideration. She was cooperating. The partnership that had targeted a minimum of 4 people across 2 states was coming apart from the inside. I called Gerald when I heard this. He was not surprised. They always blame each other, he said. Every single time. They build these things on the assumption that nothing will go wrong, and the moment it does, there's no foundation left. What's the foundation for? I said. He was quiet for a moment. Exactly, he said. The civil matter proceeded alongside the criminal investigation. Ethan, apparently having found an attorney willing to take a case with no plausible winning argument, filed a complaint against me for tortious interference with his business relationships, alleging that I had conducted a coordinated campaign to damage his professional reputation. The claimed damages were $300,000. Jessica called me when she received the filing. She was laughing in the way that prosecutors laugh when opposing counsel files something genuinely ill-advised. "I've been waiting for this," she said, suing a federal judge for exposing a fraud. In Oregon, with this evidence file, this is the best gift he could have given us. We counterfiled with a claim for $1.8 million in damages for the documented conspiracy, the costs of investigation and legal response, and the emotional distress inflicted on my daughter. Jessica included a separate action against Rachel for her role in the coordinated scheme. Combined with the DA's criminal filing, which arrived 3 days later through the Multnomah County Court, Ethan and Rachel were now facing simultaneous criminal and civil proceedings with a documented evidentiary record that Gerald described as comprehensive enough to indict twice. The arraignment was on a Thursday morning in March. I sat in the gallery with Gerald and said nothing. Claire was not present because I had asked her to let me carry this part. She had her own weight to set down. Ethan looked different in a courtroom. I have seen this transformation hundreds of times. The performance that works in restaurants and parties and living rooms does not translate to fluorescent lighting and a judge's gaze. He stood beside a public defender and entered a not guilty plea in a voice that was too controlled, the voice of someone managing panic by gripping it very tightly. Rachel stood beside her own attorney, a woman who had clearly advised her client to convey maximum cooperation, and entered the same plea. Their eyes did not meet once. The judge set a preliminary hearing for 6 weeks out and reminded both defendants of the conditions of their release, including the existing protective order prohibiting contact with me or Claire in any form. She read this aloud and looked at Ethan specifically when she said any form, a look I recognized as the kind that experienced judges deploy when they suspect a defendant needs to hear something twice. Afterward, in the parking lot, Jessica fell into step beside me without ceremony. "Their defense attorney called me this morning before the arraignment," she said. "Interested in settlement discussions. How much?" Unspecified. But the framing was significant. He said, and I'm quoting directly, his client believes there may have been a misunderstanding about the nature of the relationship. I walked for a moment without speaking. "Misunderstanding?" I said. "Yes." His word. I said what I would like to happen is a full trial, documented findings of fact, and a permanent public record that follows both of them through every background check for the rest of their professional lives. If they'd like to expedite that by pleading out, I'm agreeable. Jessica smiled. That's what I told him. Rachel's cooperation with the DA produced something I had not expected. She provided documentation relating to 2 prior targets, one in Seattle and one in Bend, that allowed investigators to revisit both of those cases with new evidence. The Bend complaint, the one that had been closed 2 years ago for insufficient evidence, was reopened. The woman's daughter, who had spent 2 years trying to get anyone to listen, called the DA's office in tears when she was notified. Gerald told me about this on a Wednesday evening during the kind of phone call where neither person speaks for a while, after the important thing is said. "You know they didn't come to you because of the money," he finally said. "I know," I said. "They came to you because you looked like someone whose family would believe whatever they were told. Respectable, self-sufficient, alone enough. I understand the calculation. They just didn't know about the 40 years. "No," I said. "They didn't." 3 months after the arraignment, Ethan accepted a plea agreement. The terms included 30 months in federal prison, 5 years supervised probation, restitution to be determined by a civil judgment, and a permanent notation in the Oregon judicial system's fraud registry. His attorney tried twice to negotiate the prison time down. The DA's office, backed by Rachel's cooperation and Gerald's file, and the reopened Ben case, declined both times. Rachel's agreement, processed separately, resulted in 18 months in a minimum security facility, loss of her mortgage broker license permanently, and the same civil liability exposure. She cooperated fully in the end. Whatever they had been to each other as siblings and as business partners, the architecture of loyalty between them had not survived what they were both facing. Jessica sent me the final plea documentation by email with a single line of her own, as clean an outcome as this type of case produces. The civil matter settled 2 weeks after the criminal plea. The settlement amount I have chosen not to specify publicly. The more significant outcome was that a portion of the settlement, through a structure Jessica designed, and I agreed to fund independently of any legal requirement, went into the Elder Financial Abuse Prevention Program at OHSU's legal clinic, the same hospital system where Claire works. The program employs 2 attorneys who help elderly patients and their families identify and respond to exactly the type of manipulation Ethan and Rachel had built their livelihoods around. Claire heard about the donation through the clinic's development office before I told her. She called me from the hospital parking lot at 11 at night between shifts. "Dad, you donated a substantial amount of money to my hospital in the name of elder abuse prevention." "I did, without telling me. I was going to tell you at Sunday dinner." She was quiet for a moment. Her voice, when she spoke, was the same voice she had when she was small, and had figured out that something I did was deliberate and significant. "You're impossible," she said. "I know. Thank you. I know." In the late summer, 4 months after the plea, and 2 months after the civil settlement, 2 letters arrived at my Astoria address on the same week. The first came from a minimum security facility south of Portland. The second from a federal correctional institution in Sheridan, Oregon. I waited a week before opening them, not from reluctance, but from the same instinct that had governed 40 years of judicial work, the understanding that timing is part of judgment, that some things should be received in the right state of mind rather than the immediate one. I opened Rachel's first. The paper was standard institutional correspondence, thin and unadorned. Her handwriting was careful in a way that suggested revision. "Mr. Smith, I know you have no reason to read this and every reason to discard it. I'm writing because my attorney told me I wasn't required to, which made me think I should. What Ethan and I did was not new for us. I understand now, sitting here with enough time to think clearly for the first time in years, that I had constructed an entire explanation for why what we did was acceptable. The people we targeted had more than they needed. They wouldn't miss it. They were old and their families were distant, and we were just, in my version of it, filling a gap in their care. I have spent months sitting with how wrong that was. Not the legal part, the human part. Your daughter trusted someone. I helped him become someone worth trusting. I'm going to spend a long time with that. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just needed you to know that I understand what we actually did." I set it down and opened the second envelope. Ethan's letter was longer. He wrote carefully, without the rhetorical grace he used in person, and the result was something closer to honesty than I had expected from him. He wrote about growing up watching his father charm people out of money and how it had looked like a skill rather than a theft for most of his childhood. He wrote that he had told himself he was different from his father because he planned better and worked harder. He wrote that the night of my birthday party, when he saw the gathering of people who genuinely valued me, he had felt something he couldn't name and had pushed it away. He did not use this as an excuse. He used it as an accounting, the way people sometimes do when they finally have nowhere left to redirect attention but inward. He ended with a paragraph about Claire. He said that whatever he had told himself about his motivations, she had been a person to him, a real one, and that the damage he had done to her ability to trust was the part he would carry longest. He said he hoped she found her way back to herself, and that she deserved someone who asked about her life instead of cataloging what surrounded it. I sat with both letters for a long time. The sun was going down over the Pacific, the sky doing what it does on the Oregon coast in summer, all orange and gray and restless. I wrote 2 replies. To Rachel, I wrote, "Your letter was received and read. The clarity you're describing takes some people a lifetime to reach. Others never reach it at all. Use the time you have to build something you can stand on. I don't wish you prolonged suffering. I wish you the kind of difficulty that produces character, rather than the kind that only produces damage. Stay away from my family permanently. That is not negotiable, and it is not vindictive. It is simply what is required. To Ethan I wrote, "You asked the wrong questions about every person you met. You asked what they had, and what it would take to access it. The fact that you now recognize this is not nothing. It's also not enough yet. 30 months is a length of time that can be wasted or used. Most people waste it because using it requires sitting with things that are uncomfortable, and you have spent your entire life developing mechanisms to avoid discomfort. I hope you find out what happens when you stop avoiding it. My daughter is healing. She doesn't need anything from you, not an apology, and not an explanation. What she needs is for people like you to stop existing in the world as you currently exist. Become someone different. That's the only form of apology that means anything." I signed both letters with my name and nothing else. Claire came to Astoria for a long weekend in August. She brought groceries and a recipe she'd been meaning to try, and we cooked together the way we used to when she was in college, the radio on, the windows open to the coast air. She had started seeing someone from her residency program, a hospitalist named Marcus, who had apparently spent their first date asking exclusively about her work and whether she'd been to the Columbia River Gorge and what she wanted to do with the decade after residency. "He asked about me," she said. "Not about whether you were comfortable financially or whether the house was big. He asked what you were like. What did you tell him?" She thought for a moment, stirring something on the stove. "I said you were the most patient person I'd ever met, and the most dangerous one." I laughed. "That's the most accurate thing anyone's ever said about me." She smiled at the stove. "He wants to meet you. Tell him to come for dinner," I said. "I'll make the fish." After she left on Sunday afternoon, I walked down to the water. The tide was going out, pulling sand in long flat sheets, the sound of it like breathing. I had lived in this house for 22 years. I had raised Claire here after her mother died. I had left the federal courthouse for the last time and driven up the coast to this house and sat on this beach and felt, for the first time in a long time, that I was simply a person rather than a position. What Ethan and Rachel had seen when they looked at me was an old man in a coastal town with a federal pension and a daughter who loved him. Easy in their calculation. Accessible, unable to defend himself with anything more than sentiment. What they had not seen were the 4 decades of watching people try to deceive each other and the particular education that produces. They had not seen the relationships built across 30 years with the people whose professional lives involved finding exactly what they had been doing. They had not seen the daughter they thought was their best instrument become instead the person who handed me the tool I needed to dismantle everything they had built. They had looked at me and seen weakness disguised as dignity. What they had actually found was the other thing entirely. I watched the water for a while. The sun moved. A pelican crossed the horizon in that ancient, unhurried way of theirs, everything about it belonging exactly where it was. I turned around and walked back to the house. There was a file on my desk from Gerald, forwarded from one of his contacts in Washington State, a report about an individual in the Puget Sound area who had recently been identified in connection with a suspicious relationship with an elderly retired physician. The pattern in the report was familiar in the way of things you have learned to recognize on sight. I sat down, put on my glasses, and began to read. Some work doesn't end when the case closes. You just move to the next file. I have patience for it. I have always had patience for it. Age doesn't diminish that quality. If anything, it sharpens it. The way long use of a tool wears it down to its essential edge, removes everything extraneous, leaves only what was always the point. I read to the end of the file, made 2 calls, sent 1 email. Then I closed the folder, went to the kitchen, and made myself a cup of coffee, standing at the window with the Pacific, out there gray and permanent, and entirely indifferent to what small human arrangements played out along its edges. I drank the coffee slowly. I thought about Claire cooking in this kitchen 2 days ago, her shoulders finally unheld, her voice finally fully her own. That's the thing about being a target someone picked because they thought age meant the end of sharpness. Sometimes the only response worth making is to demonstrate, clearly and completely, and without any particular dramatics, that they were wrong. Not for your sake. For the sake of the next person they would have walked toward if you hadn't stopped them exactly where they stood. I finished the coffee. I rinsed the cup. I went back to the desk. There was more work to do. There always is. I am not retired from the things that matter. I am only retired from being paid for them. That distinction turns out to be smaller than I once thought. If this story meant something to you, please subscribe to this channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. And click on the next story when you're ready. We'll be here.